everyone, welcome back or welcome to my channel. I am Adele Ashley. I live in Toronto and I'm just, trying to live my best life. So today I figured we would actually go over all the books that I consider kind of my favorites of all time, or like my favorites so far. And these are books that, they're not necessarily getting critical acclaim. They're not necessarily the best written books or the biggest books that ever came out, but they are the books that when I read them, they kind of made me feel something, or they were kind of perfect for the time and space that I was in at the time of reading. So, there's throwbacks, books that I read when I was 16 that I kind of still think of. There's books that I read recently that are on this list. It's kind of a whole kind of range of things, but like I said, they're not necessarily, I think, majority of these are 3-star books for me, so they're not even like those 5-star great reads, but they are the books that I absolutely love and can talk about forever. So let's get into it. So first on my list is Lock and Key by Sarah Desen. So this wasn't even the first Sarah Desen book that I read. I remember being 17 and stumbling across her books in the library and picking up a couple of them, and Lock and Key was maybe like the 4th or 5th book of hers that I had read, and this one just absolutely broke me. It is a bit of a harder story. It does deal with it was kind of as she was moving into like more kind of like real world stuff, as weird as that is to sound. But it does follow this girl Ruby, who for the past few months has been on her own in a yellow house. She's managing somehow, knowing that her mom will probably never return to her, so she's really like truly all on her own. Through circumstances, she ends up living with Cora, a sister who she hasn't seen in years, and Cora's husband Jamie, who is very down to earth and kind of like go with the flow, which seems very hard for her to understand how he's part of this, like the head of this popular networking site that's very similar to kind of like a Facebook is the best way to describe it. They have a luxurious house. She's now going to a fancy private school. They're giving her a new wardrobe. There's a promise of college and a future, which, she never really had that belief before, and it's a dream come true for her. So she's a very reluctant Cinderella in this situation. She's wary and defensive of everything that the sister and her husband are doing for her. And then there's Nate, the genial boy next door with some secrets of his own, who's unable to accept any help that Ruby's trying to give. I honestly cried my way through this. It's easily one of my favorite books. I kind of had some things happening very similar at the same time. Not necessarily related to the story and kind of what happened there, but in terms of just kind of like family dynamics and navigating that. And it was the book that I needed to read. And Sarah Desen does such a good job of portraying all of that. And I absolutely loved every single aspect of it from start to finish. This was a book, I actually borrowed it from the library and then was one of the first books that I kind of bought after reading it from the library because I loved it so much, and I have a signed copy by Sarah and I got to speak to her, and it's just truly one of my favorite books. Following that, The Idea of You by Robin E. Lee truly was just this beautiful book to me. It is marketed a lot of the time as a romance story, but it doesn't have kind of like your traditional romance elements with it. Which is pretty much all I can say without really spoiling it, but it is a romance, they fall in love and everything else, but it's just not necessarily cookie cutter fitting into the romance genre. This was honestly first described to me as Harry Styles fan fiction, and I immediately went, I'm not reading that. Like, I do not need to read Harry Styles fan fiction. I am so glad that I had a friend convince me to still read it, because that is so inaccurate to what the story actually is. So The Idea of You follows Celine Marchand, a 39-year-old owner of an art gallery in Los Angeles, who reluctantly takes her daughter Isabel to meet her favorite boy band. And since Celine's divorce, she has been really scrambling to have time and to connect with her daughter, especially since her ex-husband is able to provide a little bit more for Isabel than she is, and seems kind of to be moving on with his life. And there's this new stepmom or girlfriend who's kind of entering the picture as well. So the last thing Celine expects when she brings her daughter to this concert is that she'll make a connection with one of the members of this world famous band, which August Moon, which is best kind of described as a One Direction type band. There's 5 boys. They were on like a talent show. They were put together as a group. The boy who she ends up falling in love with, Hayes Campbell, can best be described as like the Harry Styles of the group. He's 20 years old. While the attraction is very obvious and immediate, she is very reluctant to enter into any form of relationship with him because he's 20 years old. He's almost half her age. And then what begins as a series of clandestine trysts soon evolves into a passionate and genuine relationship. And it's a journey that spans continents. He follows them kind of all around the world as they find time to meet up and continue this relationship. We have stadium tours, there's international art fairs, there's secret hideaways in Paris and Miami and on a boat. And, through the process, Celine starts to rediscover herself, and there's rediscovery of happiness and love, and she starts to move on and starts to really see herself as more than just a divorcee or a 39-year-old mother. She really just kind of like gets her identity back. And unfortunately, their Celine and Hayes' relationship becomes this viral sensation because he's kind of at the top of his career with tons of women and girls fawning over him and his group. And he's dating this 39-year-old divorced mom, and there's rabid fans. She's the target of insatiable media. And Celine must really figure out how her romantic life is impacted by how her romantic life is impacting the lives of everyone who she cares about. I truly, from start to finish, it's an absolutely beautiful story. I read it pretty much in one sitting. Like, I started reading this book at 11 p.m. and figured, I'll just read like a chapter or two, and was immediately sucked into the story and basically stayed up all night reading it, and was absolutely so sad when I finished. And sometimes I flip-flop between wanting a sequel to this book, but also acknowledging the fact that it's kind of perfect without a sequel, which is saying a lot because, we don't get that epilogue at the end or anything else. The story very much ends, and I think it ends kind of perfectly, and it makes sense, and I love it. Next I have Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. I also really enjoyed this book. There is an Amazon movie. I've talked about it before. I reread it a little bit earlier this year before the movie came out. It essentially follows Alex Claremont Diaz, who is the first son of the United States, and Prince Henry, who is the Prince of England, and they start as enemies. They definitely butt heads. They don't like each other. There's an international incident that they cause involving a cake, and they eventually kind of the PR way to fix it is that the two of them can come together and pretend to be friends and do a whole bunch of public appearances, and through that they realize that they actually kind of have a lot in common. So they slowly develop a friendship, and eventually that morphs into a romantic relationship as well. And there's the kind of you have this gay prince and the bi first son of the United States, and there's kind of this chat of if they go public with that relationship, then it's kind of creating history, but also it's a big step. And I really just remember reading this book and being like, this is so beautiful how it's written, but also it doesn't shy away from kind of the real world implications of if this were true. It's not glossing over the fact that, two people in power, unfortunately, cannot necessarily come out and just live their lives. There's a lot of considerations that happen there, and I find that it's like beautifully weaved in the story as well. I love Alex. I loved Prince Henry. They play off each other very well, and you know, I won't lie, the movie came out, I watched it, I loved it. So yeah, one of my favorite books for sure. And Casey McQuiston, quite honestly, I will read just about anything she writes because her books are that good. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow is one of those books that I would not necessarily have picked up for myself, but it was a book club pick, which I read the book club book, and I'm so glad that I did because it really opened up my horizons and in terms of what I'm reading and what I like. So Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow spans 30 years from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Venice Beach and lands few and far between as well. It follows two friends who've known each other since grade school who create Ichigo, which is an overnight success video game. It is a very intricately imagined novel that examines the multifarious nature of identity, disability, failure, and the redemptive possibilities in play. And above all, our need to connect, to be loved, and to love. So our characters are just so beautifully put together, but also in ways very broken. There is a lot of kind of video game aspects in this book. It talks about gaming. It talks about different types of elements of building a video game. And I thought it would just be too heavy, but it is done in such a way that it actually educates the reader without making you feel stupid. So all the information is there, but you find it out. They have these terms, but you get it. The characters are so great, and I loved them all. There's one section in the middle of the book that absolutely just wrecked me. And, you know, at its core, it really is a story about love and art. And it broke my heart, and then it put it back together again. And I still think about this book quite frequently and how beautifully it's done. And there's such great quotes in there. There's a section that talks about grief and, well, it talks about death, and then it also talks about grief kind of separately but together from two different characters' perspectives. And just the quotes there are so profound. Usually, sometimes like you'll even see them in my coffee quotes that I post on Mondays. A lot of the time I'm actually, quite a few of them have been from Gabrielle Zevin and from this book, because they have just, I was annotating like crazy as I read it and marking them down because absolutely stunning. And then next I read Lessons in Gravity and Leaving Everest by Megan Westfield. And these are some of I really enjoyed them. So I actually got them as e-arcs from NetGalley, and I fell in love with the stories. Lessons in Gravity follows April Stevens, an aspiring documentary filmmaker. On her internship with a production company, she finds herself suddenly immersed in Yosemite and the climbing community, and she's responsible for interviews with Josh Knox, who's a daredevil rock climber who just absolutely sucks at doing interviews. And her job is to interview him and make sure, kind of like pull all the information out of him. So he gives her one-word answers. She really struggles. She tries to figure out different tips and tricks to kind of do her best because she needs this job to graduate. And as she slowly starts to make headway with Josh professionally, she finds herself growing closer to him personally as well. And, you know, he's really the last person who she should be falling for, especially after witnessing her stunt pilot father, who was very similar, being a daredevil and everything. She witnessed him die in a plane crash a couple of months previously. And, you know, she's very hesitant to move forward. She knows that she doesn't want someone to put her through that again, but she still kind of continues. It's inevitable. She can't help but kind of fall in love with him. And she's really worried about this, especially since 1 month into her internship, she has to be dangling 3,000 feet in the air off of Sorcerer's Spine, which is this, I guess, really big and famous climbing cliff. It's a cliff. But essentially, since she has to be dangling 3,000 feet in the air off of Sorcerer's Spine in Yosemite filming while Josh is climbing to the top of this without a rope. And if anything goes wrong on that climb, it will not end well. And then leaving Everest follows Emily Winslow, a 20-year-old daughter of a Himalayan mountain guide who has climbed Mount Everest multiple times. So she does actually kind of secretly hold a record for the amount of successful Mount Everest summits. She has been living with her father kind of at base camp or at various climbing peaks around the world since she was 10, I believe. And so, for almost a decade now. And she finds that, she has all this experience mountaineering, but she does lack some experience with guys. And that kind of comes to a head with one person in particular. That kind of comes to a head with one guy in particular, Luke Norgay, her childhood best friend, who she hasn't seen since he left Nepal for college 2 years ago. And when he suddenly, unexpectedly reappears for the Everest climbing season, she's unsure what to do, yet realizes that everything that was building between them 2 years previously on the mountain is still there. So, and it's, still there, but also bigger than ever. So the two of them try to navigate that, and a big part of this as well is the fact that they're also on Everest. So there is still this mountain that they're looking to climb as guides and help people hopefully have successful summits, but also just climbing Mount Everest in and of itself is very dangerous, and that is something that they have to contend with. And that's kind of the most important thing. So maybe push aside your relationship a bit because there's a mountain. So I really like these books because both books have that daredevil adventure element to it. Both girls are so smart. They're not just kind of the men are these daredevils or they have some sort of skill and they play a sport and the girls are just there. And I especially liked how it truly feels, through Megan Westfield's writing, it truly feels as if you are in Yosemite or you are actually on Everest at base camp or camp 1, 2, 3, 4. While reading, I really loved it. Megan Westfield honestly has only written these two books, Lessons in Gravity and Leaving Everest. If she ever were to write another one, I would pick it up and read it because honestly, I truly loved these books. And then taking a big switch here, I also happen to really like It Happened One Summer by Tessa Bailey. So I had read a couple of Tessa Bailey's books before. I think it's the Fix Her Up series. They were okay for me, and then I picked up It Happened One Summer because I really needed something to read, and I loved it. So, I loved the premise of it already. It's a Schitt's Creek inspired rom-com where Piper, a Hollywood it girl, is sent by her stepfather and her wealthy family to a small Pacific Northwest beach town to kind of learn humility, I guess, and kind of get, touch grass and get real with her life a little bit. And it is the town that her late father actually lived in and owned this bar in. So she goes back to the town. She butts heads with Brendan, who's this hot, grumpy fisherman who thinks there's no way she belongs there and that she's just not going to hack it. And she's determined to show her family and Brendan that she's more than just a pretty face, that she actually knows what's going on. Except it's a really small town. As much as she's trying to avoid Brendan, everywhere she turns, she's bumping into him. People are talking about how great he is to her. And, the two of them are polar opposites, but there's very undeniable attraction simmering between them. It's such a cute story. I really, really enjoyed it. I do see the Schitt's Creek elements in it, and it really made me wonder, honestly, if I needed to move to a Pacific Northwest beach town and date a crab boat captain, because Brendan is just he's so sweet. And, there's a couple cringy moments in it, but, recharging station had me a bit ugh, please no, stop saying that. But, yeah, I really, really enjoyed this book. Next, I have The Measure by Nikki Erlich. So I did also talk about this book. This is a book I actually read this year, and I talked about it in my Everything I Read in 2023 so far video, so I'll link it up here for you guys. But that book essentially is about everyone around the world one day receives this box, and inside the box is a string, and the string lets them know how long they have to kind of like live for the rest of their life. And I absolutely loved this book. There's so many different elements that's going on with it. You have the characters who are, you know, some of them open their boxes and find out how long they have to live. There's some who absolutely refuse to open it and find out how long their string is. There's the countries that mandate that no one is going to open their box. There's the countries that mandate that if you're going into certain careers like the military or anything else, that you do need to open your box so that they know what's going on. And then there's also just kind of people in general deciding how they're going to live their lives, because they're like, well, I have a really long string, so I'm going to do whatever I want. And because I know that I'm going to go do that daredevil or adventurous thing because I'm not going to die because my string is long. And then there's the people who, on the flip side, also are doing all these things because they know that they're going to die shortly anyways. The Measure really does bring up a lot of questions, kind of like, what would you do if you got a box with a string in it? Do you think these countries are doing things correctly? But essentially, it is such a beautiful story. It's told in multiple viewpoints, and we are in the head of like different characters, and then we slowly start to see how it's all interconnected between the characters. I absolutely loved it. I've recommended it so many times to people this year. It's such a beautiful novel, and honestly, it's actually one of my contenders for my top 10 books of this year. So the Simple Wild series by K.A. Tucker is also one of my favorite series just as a whole. It's actually 4 books, or 3 books and a novella, kind of. So the first one is Simple Wild, Wild at Heart, and the novella, so book 2.5, is Forever Wild. And then book number 3, or book number 4, is Running Wild. Book 1 to 3 follow Calla Fletcher, who is a city girl who attempts to reconnect with her estranged father after finding out that after he informs her essentially that his days are numbered. So she makes the trip back to a remote frontier town where she was born. She braves roaming wildlife, odd daylight hours, exorbitant prices, and even the occasional outhouse, while Jonah, the quiet, brooding, and proud Alaskan pilot who keeps her father's business afloat and running, really is just kind of like, this is the best place ever. And for Calla, she is through and through a city girl. Like, she was born and raised in downtown Toronto. She likes her heels. She likes the big city. And to be thrust into the wilderness is just not her at all. Like, it's just not what she's used to. And Jonah really does believe that, you know, he's waiting with one hand on the throttle to fly her back home, because he does not think that she's going to be able to cut it in the wilderness, and that she's way too pampered. So Cal is determined to prove him wrong, and as time passes, she unexpectedly finds herself forming a bond with Jonah. And, you know, as he kind of starts realizing that he disapproves of her, or he doesn't disapprove of her so much, it's replaced with friendship, and Calla unwittingly finds herself torn between her desire to return back to city life in Toronto and a budding relationship with the rugged Alaskan pilot. I do have to say, Simple Wild, so the first book in the series, absolutely broke my heart. I was really crying at one point towards the end there. I do highly recommend looking at the trigger warnings, or kind of like content warnings, for the Simple Wild, because there are some elements in there that really could be triggering depending on what's going on in your life, regarding Calla and her relationship with her father. But that being said, book 1, The Simple Wild, is actually my favorite of Calla's story. And then the 4th book, in the series, Running Wild, follows Marie, who is a vet who we meet through the previous 3 books. So she is there, she's kind of a secondary character, and then we get her story is entirely book 4. I absolutely loved it. If I had to pick favorites in the series, book 1 for The Simple Wild because it's so good, and then book 4, Marie's story, is also just so lovely, and I really, really enjoyed reading it. And I have to say, both men in this series are great. Jonah very much kind of gives me It Happened One Summer and Brendan vibes. Like, there's a bit of a theme there, but city girl goes to a remote town and ends up falling in love, but honestly, so good, and recommend if you have not read them yet. And then finally on my list, I have My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. So I remember seeing on Twitter when Kate Elizabeth Russell was kind of thinking of this book. So in the middle of Me Too, she was talking about writing a book about a girl who, through Me Too, is starting to realize that the relationship she had with a professor or with a teacher was very inappropriate, and she essentially got Me Too'd. And it's very much dark academia. It's told in 2 parts. So I believe it's set in 2010 and 2017, I believe is the year. So 2010 is when this woman very much is a child. She's in high school, and she has this relationship with a teacher. And then 2017 is kind of told present day, and her kind of seeing a shift in that relationship and what exactly it is that is going on and what happened. It is such an uncomfortable read. Does talk about her being groomed from her perspectives, I should say, because you have the past and the future and the present. But it is so well done that it works. And like I said, this is another book that I would highly recommend looking at content warnings, or maybe passing on if that is something that would not be beneficial to you to read. But if not, it is a very well done and beautiful book. It's just uncomfortable, but uncomfortable in kind of in a thought-provoking way, and really helps you understand how someone could be in a position where something feels wrong, or they might suspect that it's wrong, but they end up still kind of going down that path. So that is essentially all the books that I would list as my favorites so far. Like always, that can always change, and as I read more books, more are going to get added to that list. But please let me know in the comments if there's any books that if you have read any of these and loved them, what you would recommend, and also just what your favorite books are, because I am always looking to add to my TBR. Till next time, bye.